Turn your Bibles to Joshua chapter 8 is where we're ready to start tonight. Joshua chapter 8. Joshua chapter 7, you remember that children of Israel, they had left Jericho, they'd gone to Ai, they'd gone to take over that city, and when they got there, they were unable to do so. The reason being because of, as the Lord said, there's sin in your camp. Well, they found out Achan had taken some of the goods from Jericho, some of the gold and silver, a Babylonian garment, and he'd taken it and he'd hid it in his tent, in the floor, or under the floor of his tent, I guess properly should say. And in hiding it, he had taken what God had said no one was to take. Remember, everything was to be destroyed except for certain things, and those certain things, the gold, the silver, and the vessels of bronze, basically, you could say really what they would have been. They were to be given to God. They were consecrated to God, but everything else was to be destroyed. But Achan had taken stuff. And so the children of Israel were not able to overcome Ai because God says, no, you got to get this out. You got to get this sin out. And we talked about that. Well, now they're going to go to Ai again in the 8th chapter, and we're going to see this time they're going to succeed. And the reason they succeed is because they have done exactly what God wanted them to. They have cleansed the temple. They've straightened all this out, if you will. Yes, Achan is past. He's dead. But at the same time, too, they've straightened all the problem that's there out. And they are able then to overcome the city. And what we want to do is look at the text, and then got a couple of lessons we want to learn from it. And so let's look at the text. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid nor be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise, go up to Ai. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land." Here's the gift of God. Here's what I've given to you. Now think about this. Think about it from several different standpoints. Think about it, first of all, from the assurance and the confidence that God gives to Joshua at this point in time. And Joshua, in turn, is going to give that same confidence to the people later on, beginning in verse 3, when Joshua explains his strategy. But there's the confidence that God gives to Joshua as he speaks to him, and as he tells him that he's going to give him the king, he's going to give him the people, and he's going to give him the city and the land. He says, you're going to win. You're going to win. And we've talked about, when we talked about Jericho in the 5th and 6th chapters, we talked about how that the confidence there and having a victory assured before you ever, so to speak, play the game, how confident and how reassuring that would have been. Well, Joshua is reminded of this. And so it says, "And you shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king." Now remember, this gets a little tricky a little later on in the text. What do you remember what they did to the king of Jericho? They killed him, but do you remember how they killed him? They killed him with a sword. And so now why this gets sticky is because we're going to find out that he's hung, and we're going to have to try to reconcile the two. And I'll give you an answer. I don't know that it's the answer, but I'll give you an answer. But anyway, just notice that. So do the king as you did Jericho and its king, only its spoil and its cattle you shall take as booty for yourself, lay an ambush for the city behind it. God gives Joshua a little bit of a strategy. Lay in ambush behind it. Now we'll see that strategy discussed and carried out the rest of the chapter. But what I want you to notice, especially in this verse 2, is that now all of a sudden they're going to be able, they, the children of Israel, that is, are going to be able to take of the spoils of the land. Now in Jericho, as we already said, they couldn't do it. And some would say, well, what's the difference? Why could they not at Jericho and they can at Ai and seemingly other places as we go along? Well, probably the best guess is that Jericho was the first, if you will, the first to be defeated. And in defeated, it would have been the first fruits. And in being the first fruits, remember of the Old Testament, remember when you had the first fruits of anything, when you had a crop. I started to say a garden, but that's really not a good. I mean, you had a crop. You have a crop, and that crop was sitting there in the first fruits, the first part of the harvest. You gave, and you gave as a sacrifice to God. And so as you gave that sacrifice to God, that was the first fruits, and that was the sacrifice of the first fruits. But then you could take the rest, and now everything else that was left was yours, and you could keep everything else. And so some have speculated that this idea of first fruits applies, and why they destroyed Jericho, but at Ai they were able to take some of the spoils of it. But notice that he says that you're going to lay an ambush. Like I said, this is going to be discussed a little later on. But this courage that must have been given, this confidence that they must have had. Joshua then, verse 3, arose, and all the people of war, to go against Ai, and Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor. In other words, he takes 30,000 men, and that's who he's going to use to fight the war, and sent them away by night. And he commanded them, saying, Behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city, behind the city. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. And then I and all the people who are with me will approach this city, and it will come about when they come out against us as at the first, that we shall flee before them. For they will come out after us until we have drawn them from the city. For they will say, they are fleeing before us at the first. Therefore, we will flee before them. Then you shall rise from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand. And it will be, when you have taken the city, that you shall set the city on fire, according to the commandment of the Lord you shall do. See, I have commanded you. Look at what he says. It's a simple strategy, but it's a great strategy. Go behind the city. Archaeologists tell us that if Bethel is where Ai is where we think that it is, that behind the city there was a natural dip in the terrain of the land. And it would have been, while it's a wooded area, it would have been easier to have gone into this dip in the land and not be seen. Now, they're going to do all this at night. They're going to go kind of hide behind, if you will, the city at night. Joshua, though, what his plan is, you're going to take these men, you're going to go behind the city. And I'm going to take some, and we're going to go up to the city. And basically what they do is they go up to the city, and they say, nana, nana, boo, boo. And the city folks, if you will, of Ai come running out to take them. Now, that's the strategy. Now, we're going to see it played out here in just a few minutes, but think about this. It's a simple yet effective strategy. The folks at Ai are going to figure, well, we beat those suckers once, we'll beat them again. You know, we put them to shame once, we'll put them to shame again. Not a problem. And so, as Joshua says, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to take care of it. And then he says, as they're fleeing, they're going to come after us. I want you to come in. You've been behind the city. I want you to come into the city, and I want you to burn the city. Because remember, they're going to destroy it. They're going to destroy it just like they did at Jericho. But notice and think about the difference between the two. How was Jericho destroyed? What'd they do? Marched around the walls. And really, you could say Jericho was destroyed by what? A miracle, right? I mean, they didn't take a hand and take a hammer, say, and beat on the walls. It was done really by a miracle. This time, though, Ai is going to be taken really by force, right? Power, might. And so there's a difference in the way they're taken, but they're still taken, of course, by the hand of God. Then notice verse 8, if we're going to kind of look at this and kind of fill all this in. It says, and it will be that when you have taken the city, that you shall set the city on fire. Now, I want you just to catch this. I want you to catch what Joshua's told the people. Is this everything Joshua told the people? Don't know. Could Joshua have told them? Could Joshua have started this way? God came to me and this is what he said. Could have. But if this is all that Joshua said to the people, think about what he said in verse 8. He says, and it will be when you take the city. Not if, not supposedly, not possibly, not if everything works out all right or if everything goes as planned. He says, but when you take the city. Once again, confidence that the leadership is giving. This is leadership. This is as Jim has said a couple of times. You know, he taught taught a series of lessons. He said some years ago on Joshua, the leader. This is a good leadership quality, characteristic, to give the people confidence, to give them reassurance, to give them what they need, and to give them the confidence and reassurance that you can do it. You can do what has been laid out for you. And somebody would like to say before we move on. Well, Joshua therefore sent them out, and they went to lie in ambush and stayed between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. And remember, Bethel is on the west side. It's not very far through there. I've forgotten how many miles. Well, I know I read one place where it's 15, but most folks think it's only like 5 miles. It's not 15. And so it's very short distance in between. And so it says that Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai, but Joshua lodged that night among the people. Once again, a good leadership tactic. Leader being with the people. Leader making sure that he doesn't say, you go here and you do this and you do that and you go over here and do that. He's with the folks. He's in the middle of them. He's part of it. He's part of the working class, so to speak. So Joshua lodged with them that night. Joshua rose up early, verse 10, in the morning, and mustered the people together, or mustered the people. Now, I'll be honest, I had to look up the word mustard. You might not, you probably didn't, but I did. I mean, you probably didn't have to look it up, but I had to look it up. And it's the idea of gather together. He organized the people. I forgot who it was, but one individual I was reading talked about how that he probably gathered them into battalions, but he organized the people. And so he didn't just come as a group. They just didn't come up as a group and sort of, when we all get there, we all gather, this is what we're going to do. This was an organized effort. This was not something where, we're going to just kind of play it by ear. And ever how we play it by ear, that's how we're going to do it. No, they organized the people. They went up. He and the elders of Israel before the people of Ai, and all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near. And they came before the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now a valley lay between them and Ai. So he took about 5,000 men. He set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai. Remember, that's what we were talking about, that kind of that where the land goes down on the west side of the city. And when they had set the people, all the army that was on the north of the city and its rear guard on the west of the city, Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. So Joshua gets everything set when the folks can't see what's going on. You see, we might look at it, we might say, how in the world did Ai not see these folks going around? And how did they not see them coming up? And well, because it was night. It's dark. And dark was dark because who came up with streetlights? Do you remember who came up with streetlights? A fellow by the name of Benjamin Franklin came up with streetlights. He wasn't there at Ai. And so they didn't have streetlights. They didn't have lights. And we all are not, probably we all didn't, but a lot of us got to see darkness last Friday night, right? Darkness is very disorienting. I've gone through this before, but Suzanne and I were out. We went out to eat and go grocery shopping, and we came back home, and we came all the way down. We cut through, but we came all the way down to the red light at Old Hickory, and turned in. And I was on the stop. I was at the stop before I really realized, and I told Suzanne, I said, "See, that's how darkness is disorienting." Back several years ago, Mother was in a assisted living, and I was with her one evening, and a tornado came through, and it damaged the facility. And so that night, I got to push a lot of little old backsides up in buses. You know, I would stand on the ground, and they would get about one step up, and that's as far, bless their heart, as they could get. And so I was behind them pushing them up. Well, I took Mother. My sister lived across town, and she said, "You need to come here. We've got lights. Bring Mother and come on." So I did, and we got into a major intersection. There were no cars coming, but there were no lights anywhere. And I was 3/4 of the way through it before I realized where I was. And then I stopped. I put on the brakes, and Mother said, "What?" I said, "Well, don't you see where we are?" She said, "I can't see anything." Well, no, it's dark. But darkness disorients, you can't see. These folks couldn't see what was going on. Joshua took care of all of this at night, set everything in place. And then verse 14, it happened when the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried and rose early and went out against Israel to battle, he and all of his people, at the appointed place before the plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. Excuse me. And Joshua and all Israel made as if they were beaten before them, and fled by the way of the wilderness. So all the people who were in Ai were called together to pursue them. And they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. There was not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not go out against Israel, or after Israel, excuse me. So they left the city open and pursued Israel. Now, there's a couple of things that come to mind, but there's a couple of things said in the text that are interesting. First of all, notice the fact that it says, it happened that the king of Ai saw it, that the men of the city hurried, rose early, and went out against Israel to battle, and he and all of his people at an appointed place before the plain. That phrase, that's part of that phrase there, at an appointed place before the plain. I looked into it a little bit further because it doesn't flow in English. It doesn't flow real well. And so you have to go dig a little deeper. But what you find out is that evidently there is some sort of signal that is given. And we see this in verse 18. It says, Joshua, stretch out the spear. There's a signal that's going to be given so that the people know. And so even the people that were in ambush behind the city somehow could see this signal. Now, I can't explain it because the text doesn't tell us. But they were able to see, okay, all of this is starting up. And so I want you to notice the fact Israel goes up. They look at what it says, verse 15, they made as if they were beaten. And so they began to retreat. They began to run from the city. And all of the men, notice what it says, all of the men pursued them. And verse 17, to even clarify that, says, not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. Now, here's the thing I want to point out that just kind of hit me as interesting as I was thinking about this and studying it. You remember we talked recently about the fact that there were 3 times where the children of Israel had to go to Jerusalem for feasts yearly. And when they went to those feasts, they all went, all the men went. And yet the promise by God is that nothing would happen to their property when they were gone. And God, through his providence, even though all the men were gone, never allowed Israel to be overtaken while they were gone to Jerusalem for their feast. The protection of God. The protection of God here is that everybody leaves Ai. And yet God's still going to defeat them. So God's still with Israel. Even at this point, God is drawing all the people out so that they can ultimately, if you look at it, they killed everybody. And so God is helping them once again. How God works through all of this. We don't always understand the providence of God, but we always see the hand of God. And so as all the people left Ai, they left, the city opened, they pursued Israel, and the Lord said to Joshua, stretch out the spear that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand. This evidently was the signal. And this evidently was, there was some sort of, what a lot of folks believe, some sort of flag possibly attached to a spear. And no one really knows, because the text really doesn't let us in on it. It just says stretch out the spear. But it's believed that this was some sort of a flag that was attached to the spear, and it was to get folks to see, okay, it's all taking place. So those in ambush, verse 19 is where I am now, arose quickly out of their place. They ran as soon as he had stretched out his hand. They entered the city, took it, and hurried to set the city on fire. So those that were behind the city, that seemingly weren't in the fight, so to speak, when they find out, when Joshua raises this spear and they see the signal, they come running. And as they come running, they notice several things. First of all, it says, verse 19, they arose quickly. They realized that haste was important. They entered, secondly, the city. They entered the city. Thirdly, they took the city. So they went and made a thorough search of the city and basically claimed it, if you will, for them, for Israel. And then fourthly, it says they hurried to set the city on fire. Why? Because that was the way they were going to destroy it. That was the way they was going to get rid of it. And when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended to heaven. So they had no power to flee this way or that way. And the people who had fled to the wilderness turned back on the pursuers. They had to surrender. There was nothing they could do. They realized that they were trapped. They couldn't go back to the city, fortified though it might be, because they had left it open. And Israel had run in, and they had set fire to everything. But yet they realized that the army, once they set the city on fire, they came from one direction. The army that supposedly had been running from Ai turns around now, and there's nowhere to go. They are trapped. They are sandwiched. And so they are defeated. Now, when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city, and that the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. Then the others came out of the city against them. So they were caught in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side, and they struck them down, so that they let none of them remain or escape. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. So they've taken care of everybody. They've annihilated everybody. They take the king. In verse 24, it came to pass, when Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, and there's a thought that is just gruesome to me. I mean, war is never a pleasant thought to think about. Fighting in first century or in the ancient of days was not pleasant to think about, because it was hand-to-hand combat. I mean, they didn't have tanks and airplanes and guns. It was hand-to-hand, shield and sword and just knock down, drag out, if you will. And yet they killed all of them. That area, the blood on the ground in that area must have been terrible. The stench of the bodies a few days later, terrible. But nevertheless, it says, when they had all fallen, they returned to Ai, struck it with the edge of the sword. Now verse 25. So it was that all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Obedience is not always pretty. Think about times in your life where you realized you had to give up stuff in order to do what the Lord said. You didn't get to do something that you wanted to do because you knew that it wasn't the thing to do. Think about sacrifices that you've made. Obedience is not always pretty. It's necessary. It's what God expects. And so this picture is not pretty, but it is what God wants. And so they killed 12,000 people. And Joshua, verse 26, did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the spear until they had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. It's almost thought of, remember in the Old Testament where they had to hold the hands up? Israel, won during that time. Well, it sounds very similar, doesn't it? Joshua holds his hands up till everybody's defeated, and then Joshua is able to lower his hands. The livestock, verse 27, and the spoil of that city Israel took as booty for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai, made it a heap forever, a desolation to this day. And the king of Ai he hanged on a tree. See, that's where we get into what did he do? Well, they killed. We carried you back to verse 2. They killed the king of Jericho with sword, and yet they're told to do that with the king of Ai, and yet they hung him. There's reason to believe in the grammar that is used that he was dead when he was hung. And so if that be true, the possibility is then that he was killed with the sword and then he was hung, sort of to make a show, if you will, of what was going on. We don't really know, and to be honest, there seems to be a plausible answer, but there seems to be a contradiction. Let's hope that the plausible explanation is true. I believe that it is. It makes very much sense. If you go back and look with me for just a minute. Go back and look in Deuteronomy 21. This is part of where this plausible explanation comes from. Deuteronomy 21, beginning in verse 22. He says, if a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree. In other words, you put him to death, and you hang him on a tree. It's not you put him to death by hanging him on a tree. You put him to death and hang him on the tree to make him an example. His body then shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For he who is hanged is accursed of God. Now, application in Deuteronomy is different, is not referencing Joshua here, Joshua chapter 8, but the same principle can be said, that it seems as if, according to Deuteronomy 21, you find a man that sins, what can you do? Well, you can kill him and then you can hang him. And that's probably what they did here with regards to the king of Ai. They killed him, probably with a sword, and then they hung him, just as God had said. Any questions, comments, suggestions, thoughts on that? Be glad to entertain them. Okay, so it says, and soon as the sun was down, Joshua commanded that they should take his corpse down from the tree, cast it at the entrance of the gate of the city, and raise it over it a great heap of stones that remain to this day. So there's the possibility. There's the fact that Joshua did. He hung him, but yet he took him down at the end of the day. So Joshua then builds an altar to the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the children of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whose stones over which no man has wielded an iron tool. In other words, take your stones. Now, here's a question. They're going to take stones and they're going to build an altar. And the stones could not be cut. They had to be what you would call pure stones, original stones, stones that you picked up. Where they got the stones, we don't know. Some have speculated that these are some of the ones that they picked up when they crossed the river, when they crossed the Jordan River. The plausibility of that doesn't make a lot of sense, because that means they're going to be carrying stones a lot. They carried them to Jericho. When they left Jericho, they brought them to Ai. Then they had to carry them back, and they brought them back. That's just, theologians get off on stuff, and sometimes it's really strange. It's probably they found these stones in fields right there where they were. But the stones couldn't be cut. That's the key right here, at least to the point of what we've read. They had to be uncut stones, natural stones. Whatever stone you found, whatever shape it was, you bring it. And we're going to make an altar. And so it is there that they're going to offer. And notice what it says. They offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. There's a difference. Remember, in the Old Testament, you had different offerings. You had burnt offerings, you had peace offerings, wave offerings, you had types of offerings. Sometimes you had animals, you had cereal offerings, you had different types of offerings. A burnt offering was just that. You took an animal, you laid it upon an altar, and it was burnt through and through. It was to a crisp. Peace offering was a little different. You would bring an animal, the priest would take part of the animal as a sacrifice, and maybe take very little of the animal, but take part of it as a sacrifice, and would give the rest back to the individual that brought it. And if not to them exactly, give it to those that were hungry and in need. But it was an offering of peace to say, I am at peace with what's going on, and we are at peace with one another. And so it kind of has a dual or twofold purpose. If you're interested in studying about the peace offering, go back to Leviticus chapter 7, and there you'll find a greater discussion of it. But they were to offer a burnt offering, and they were to offer a peace offering. And there in the presence of the children of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. This is, if you read books on Joshua, there's an interesting discussion in a lot of books about exactly the writing on the stones. What was it? What was this, as it calls it, the law of Moses, a copy of the law of Moses? In biblical times, kings often took rocks and they would plaster them, they would cover them with plaster. And then in that plaster, they would write the details of what the king had done. It doesn't seem as if these stones were going to be covered with plaster, but on them was written, and it says, written the law of Moses, probably not all the law. Remember, there's a lot to that law, right? Go back to the book of Exodus. We think of the law, we think, well, the Ten Commandments. Well, go back and read in the book of Exodus. And you'll find out that the law was a lot. Moses received, yes, the Ten Commandments, but he received the law on the 2 tablets written on both front and back, right? There was a lot of writing on them. But probably, we guess that they didn't sit down and write all of the law on the stones. They did write at least the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue on the stones. They wrote on the stones, they wrote a copy of the law, which Moses had written. And all Israel, with their elders and officers and judges, stood on either side of the ark before the priest, the Levites, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as he who was born among them. Half of them were in front of Mount Gerizim, and half of them in front of Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded before, that they should bless the people of Israel. So gathered together were all the people. But I want you to think about something. I want you to go back, and I want you to look in verse 33, where it makes this statement. It says, the judges stood on either side of the ark before the priests, the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the stranger as well as he who was born among them all. You see, Israel took in folks that were not natural born. We often think of, well, you had to be born a Jew, and that's all that they would take in. But the stranger here, they took them in. They were with them. They were there worshiping God. They were there thanking God for the victory that God had given them at Ai. And they were with the Jews. So the Jews took other folks in. They had, what did you call them? Do you remember? Proselytes. Yeah. Yeah, you were proselytized, but you were a proselyte. And so they took them in. See, so, if you've read books on the Old Testament, some books will talk about how that the Israelites didn't take anybody in. They did. And evidently, and this verse is one that's used to point out, yeah, they did. And so they gathered together. They're there worshiping God. They're there thanking God for what has happened. And verse 34 says, afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessings and the cursings, according to all that is written in the book of the law. The blessings and the cursings occur. I better look that up, make sure again. But it's Deuteronomy 27, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, the curses are in 27. The blessings are in 28. Yes, that's what it is. Deuteronomy 27, it's the cursings. They begin really about verse 15. And then, thank you, Ken, by the way. But then the blessings are in verse 20, or excuse me, chapter 28 of book of Deuteronomy. So yes. So thank you, Ken. Yes. And there they read them. They read those blessings and they read those cursings because they were important to the children of Israel. And it says, verse 35, that there was not a word of all Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel with the men, the little ones, and the strangers who were living among them. So gathered together all the assembly, men, women, and children. Yes, children can sit in the worship service. Gathered together all the little ones, gathered together everybody. And so it says, as they gathered them together with the little ones and the strangers who were living among them, these strangers living among them, they gathered together and they read the law. I don't know, and I didn't research this to find out the exact answer. But let me rephrase this. There are many times, not just in the feast of the Jews. Here would be a good example. After a war, where part of the law or all the law is read. They didn't have, like we just did. We need to find that. Where is it? Deuteronomy 27, 28. We have that. They didn't have that. Basically, what they had was carried around really in their heart and in their head. And so they would carry around the law. They have it written to refer to all the time. And so it was constantly read to them so that they knew it, and they knew it very well. But the interesting aspect, at least for me, is the last part is, okay, you have the battle, and then you have the victory, and then you have the worship of God, thanking Him for the victory that you've gained. Something else somebody wants to say. I've got a couple of things I want to look at here, but well, as I was looking at this and looking at it more like a preacher than anything, I began to think about victories and victories in the church. And, we have victories in the church. We have times in which everything just goes like it always goes. We come together, we come to church, we sing, we pray, we take the Lord's Supper, give of our means, have preaching, we go home. And then there are days that it just seems special. Maybe there's more people here that are visiting, or maybe somebody responds to the Lord's invitation, or something to that effect. And man, you say, boy, that was a super great day. We have those victories. We have those times in which maybe we've studied with people and they obey the gospel, or we have a time in which somebody that hadn't been here for a long time starts coming back to church. We say, boy, this is a great day. This is a day of victory. So there are victories, and there are victories in our life. We often fight the battle with Satan, and we need victories, and there are victories. And I got to thinking about some of the lessons that are in this chapter that remind us that when we're fighting these battles of the victory that becomes ours, what can we learn out of this chapter to help us gain those victories? Just like they defeated Ai, they gained the victory over Ai. They had lost before, but they gained the victory now. What is it, and what are the things that we need to keep in our mind from this chapter that help us in fighting the fight and gaining the victories? Well, let's think of just a few things. First of all, along the way, we'll have defeats. There will be times, there will be setbacks, there will be obstacles, there'll be discouragement, there'll be heartaches, there'll be hurts, there'll be disappointments. It doesn't mean that we stop. It doesn't mean that we say, well, I'm going to give up. Churches have problems. Folks move off. Folks go somewhere else to church. Folks quit coming to church. Programs that you think are going to be good programs. I was talking to an elder at the lectureship, an elder down from Baldwin, Mississippi. And as I was talking to him, he said, well, every once in a while I go in and he says, I have to kind of encourage Ricky. And Ricky's their preacher. He says he gets discouraged about things that are going on in the church. Well, I'm sure he does, because we all do. We've all been there as preachers. But maybe he needs to read 7th and 8th chapter of the book of Joshua and know that sometimes there are defeats. Secondly, understand that victories come at a cost. Think about the effort that was made, the people that lost their lives. Thirdly, victories come after great planning and great strategy. There's a great strategy here. I said at the very beginning, one of the greatest strategies that I see is the fact that Joshua basically comes in and he goes from what would be considered east to west and cuts the land almost middle in two to divide the folks so that the land can be captured. Strategy here in the 8th chapter of, okay, we're going to put these men, we're going to put them behind the city. You're going to go in this little area and you're going to come out and we're going to run to the city and we're going to run out. And when we run out, everybody's going to follow us. And you come in, you burn them, and you come in behind them. We often do things sort of haphazardly without thinking, or we think at the last moment. Well, there's strategy sometimes that needs to be involved. Victories are given to us by God. Remember, we said, right early on, God said, I give you this. We should always include God, prayer for plans and activities and defeats, but prayer also for thanksgiving in the end should always be included in our victories. And we should always remember, I've got 2 or 3 other things here, but I don't want to keep you too late, but we should always remember that sometimes we take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And if you go and look at the children of Israel, they go in Joshua chapter 7, they go to take Ai thinking we're going to take them because we took Jericho. But they don't. And so they really took a step, they took probably 2 steps back, because they have to go and they have to figure out what's wrong. God tells them, well, there's sin in the camp. They clean out the camp, so to speak. They get rid of Ai. They've taken their steps back. Now they're going to take a step forward. And in our victories, we have to remember that we have to sometimes take a couple of steps back in order to take a step forward. And so sometimes we seemingly lose, but in the end we gain. Well, there's other lessons to learn from this. Anything else anybody'd like to say or ask? We'll get into the 9th chapter. We will finish the 9th chapter next week. I hope to carry over into the 10th chapter. The 9th chapter is very short, and the 10th chapter goes along with it pretty well. Do you remember what happens in the 10th chapter? Do you remember something standing still in the book of Joshua? Yep, sun stand still in the 10th chapter. So we're going to soon find out about the sun standing still. All right, well, let's bow forward to prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, for the blessing of it, for the opportunity to study your word, for the fact that you love us and watch over us, for the fact that you do protect us and you do provide for us. We're thankful for this great book of Joshua, for what it means, and for the fact that we can learn that success, victory can be ours, but yet we have to learn the lessons that go along with it as well. We ask that you be with us, watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great, great week. We'll see you Sunday.